Hey there, comrades. Welcome to this week's episode of Red Library, a political education podcast for today's left. We're bringing you part 2 of my conversation with Comrade Alex on Slavoj Zizek's book Lenin 2017 from, you guessed it, 2017, marking the centenary anniversary of the Russian Revolution, by reading through some of the later thought of Vladimir Lenin as he grappled with the limitations and ongoing challenges of the first successful socialist revolution in world history. So we'll keep this one short so you can get right into the episode, but in the event that you have not listened to part 1, please go ahead and pause here, go back, check that one out, as we build on a lot of the same themes and topics in this episode and delve even deeper into the theoretical and philosophical underpinnings of Zizek's analysis of Lenin and the real deep philosophical problems he was grappling with. Just as a short preview of what you can expect in this episode, we're going to tackle more questions regarding the nature of freedom, particularly freedom under the banner of neoliberal capitalism, the false choices it provides, the limitations, the clever tricks it plays on us living in a capitalist society, the nature of authority, Lacan's theory of discourses, and we also try to connect up the relationship between Hegel, the failures of freedom under capitalism, and the entire Limp Bizkit discography. How many other podcasts can you think of that go that far, huh? Not many. All right, y'all. Enjoy the show, and we will check back in with you afterward for a few brief comments and a short discussion of what you can expect over the next few weeks.
Talking about Lenin, we've been talking about this book, psychoanalysis, Zizek, all these perspectives, and I kind of want to move on to this next section in the book, which is called Leninist Freedom, because I think it's really interesting. I think it's like Zizek is basically taking like a perspective on Lenin that I think is it's like pretty unique. Because in a sense, what Lenin was considering was the opposition between formal and actual freedom. And I think that we could kind of define that as like formal freedom being the only true embodiment of freedom. And formal freedom just means sort of having the notional sense that you have free choices, but in a sense, it never really appears as a free choice to you, that you're actually subjugated to some bigger authority. And the actual freedom is usually... like the typical sense that I think it's conceived of is like actual freedom is usually some kind of ruse or like appearance of like, it's almost like if you imagine like animal freedom in the sense that Badiou might use it or something, that like you have sort of animal impulses towards enjoyment, and that your freedom is not embodied by those impulses, but our society sort of opens up all these possibilities for you to like pursue your like animal enjoyments, like do drugs, like have sex, listen to music, and go to concerts and stuff. And like,
you hear that, kids? Do drugs, have sex.
I don't not condone those things, but I do conceive of those things not as being like embodiments of our freedom as subjects, but as being like sort of the temptations of our society, and like it's, I don't know, maybe it's like sort of absconded core, like it's perverse core, right? Like what it's really encouraging us to do is to invest in it over and over and over again by subjugating ourselves to those impulses that it claims like embody our freedoms. And so we live in like a permissive society, I guess you could say, but it's a permissive society that permissiveness is a mask that covers up a very authoritarian and like rigid structure of like, you must obey.
So the idea would be that the more we sort of pursue these kind of animalistic urges, let's say, towards sexual gratification, towards visceral bodily pleasure through drugs, that in some way to conceive of these things as actually being embodiments of our freedom is directly sort of integrating ourselves into the like larger social structure, which is very authoritarian and uses that to sort of enforce consent in some way.
Yeah, it's like that is our subjugation in a sense, is like our investiture in these forms of collective freedom, quote unquote freedom, that we all experience as subjects of the society, but don't actually amount to any kind of freedom in the sense that like Lenin might be talking about when he was talking about the freedom that we might have as subjects. Like, for example, one of the examples they make in the text is that like the Mensheviks' criticism of the Bolsheviks amounted to them criticizing the working class, quote unquote the working class, and thus being counter-revolutionary. Yeah, like if I represent the working class, because this happened, I feel like this has happened to me in actual conversations I've had with leftists, right? Like I represent X, like I'm black or I'm Latina, and I represent this entire group of people in the things that I say because I'm like a part of that group, and therefore if you disagree with me, you disagree with that group,
with
and
the
therefore
entire
everything
group.
you say is objectively wrong, and you as a human being are objectively wrong in your existence. And like it's like this very strange appeal to objectivity as subjective. It's almost like the objectivity of the situation is grounded in my subjectivity, but it doesn't allow for subjective freedom in any way. It's like a fully well-defined objective type of scenario where there's only one right answer, and like only certain people get to assert those right answers, right? And it's just like whoever gets to the punch first, right? Like if you get to claim that you're the most oppressed in the room, then you have more authority to like conviction denounce anything anybody else in the room says. Strangely enough, people like buy into it. It's kind of like, oh yeah, that's true, you know. Like they are the most oppressed person in the room, but they have the highest caliber of criticism in the room.
So
and
the
like,
implication of that would be that, you know, whenever you see these processes unfolding, let's say in a meeting or in a room about organizing or whatever it might be, that the real kind of underlying things that are happening here have a lot more to do with the way we conceptualize freedom, the way that objectivity versus subjectivity works. So these are very, very complicated philosophical problems that are underlying these kind of group dynamics. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it takes that's a little problematic to like a completely different level, right? It's like this is philosophically ungrounded, you know, like
that's our version of this is problematic. It's like this is philosophically ungrounded.
Yeah, like no, this has no philosophical underpinnings. No, but I think that it's absolutely something that could use philosophical lens of critique, and it's definitely a criticism that is sort of being deployed here by Zizek. On account of Lenin and his perspective. Mm-hmm. I think prior to this, maybe in this section, he's talking about third worldism in organizing, sort of predicts that there's going to be some kind of like massive worker uprising that will somehow transcend the national borders, international borders, and be the next sort of revolutionary impulse, you know, that it won't be in the first world, it'll be somewhere else, right? And I think that the criticism that's being made here is kind of like against the idea of really existing socialisms, which is like a term that I feel like was invented in a sense to highlight or to legitimize socialism. But Zizek's argument here is that it kind of does the opposite. That in a sense, all that it really does is announce socialism's like failure, not on account of like the fact that it didn't take hold in certain places or that those movements aren't legitimate, but in the sense that having to appeal to the fact that socialism exists as such, just period, and like having no deeper acknowledgement of the effectiveness of that socialism other than it's there. Mm-hmm. Is actually in some senses more of a conceit to the defeat of socialism than it is to the celebration of its successes. Like it's more of a just to like be able to assert that it's there, and you can kind of see this in relation to what I was saying about that's objective as subjective position that a person in a group, you know, session might take, of like the fact that I'm here is like a testament to my culture, and just on the basis that I participate in this group or that I am a part of this group, and no further consideration, just the fact that it exists is like my ultimate appeal, my ultimate, like, I hate to use that term Trump card, but like my ultimate, like, you know, shutdown of anything that you might have to say. And it's almost like, isn't that a signal of the defeat or like the absolute impotence of like a cultural presence, when the only thing that you can really allude to is just the fact that it exists as such? That's not so much a celebration as it is, please desperately don't forget that this exists, because it's the only thing that we have left is that it exists, you know. And like that seems like a much different perspective to take on that kind of idea. And I'm not trying to take away, like, obviously, like, people who represent their culture and feel like they are advocates of their particular group in the world, like, I'm not saying you shouldn't be proud of that. I'm just saying, like, there are ways of celebrating culture that are positive and not just being used to kind of impose a certain kind of order on a debate or a conversation, or...
Well, at the very least, it seems that what we're saying is just that the way that culture operates in that particular way is very complicated, and it can have these sort of gaps and contradictions in itself, where it functions in a way that is different than what it appears. And at the very least, it's, you know, I mean, I think part of why we're doing this whole show in the first place is to offer perspectives that get you to think critically. I mean, it's what Marx said. It's a ruthless criticism of all that exists. I mean, nothing is safe. We're coming for you. Nothing is safe. Everything will be critiqued.
And so, you know, Zizek goes on to kind of implement this idea of like an objectively existing social order to try to like an objectively existing social order that appears as subjective, to try to like criticize. He actually invokes Hegel. He kind of says that actual freedom shouldn't be defined as just like some opposition to formal freedom where it always is false, that like it always has to appear in the guise of its opposite. Like he's saying that that's not how we should conceive of actual freedom, but that actual freedom is only existent when you're able to posit the presuppositions of your position of enunciation, or that like you're able to actively manipulate or change the coordinates of your position in a social exchange, right? Or like in a political exchange. And so rather than just making some allusion to the fact that really existing socialism is a thing, like there are actually countries that implemented socialism, it would be like just referring to them as being legitimate on account of just their existence. It would be something very different, like undermining the coordinates of like their sort of subordinated position to what is standard in the rest of the world, but not just on account of like their existence. And right, obviously I don't know how this exactly would appear. I don't think he necessarily gives a direct example, but he is basically, the next thing that he brings up is sort of like how liberal ideology in our contemporary society uses that idea of freedom of choice, which would be there's the potential for you to be able to like sort of reorient or redefine your own circumstances to be able to assert a new paradigm within which you can exist as a subject that has more autonomy, as opposed to being subjugated and fully, so much so that even your subjectivity is just a restatement of the objective fact of your subjugation, right?
Yeah, well, what I'm reminded here is the very famous and common phrase that Zizek is associated with now, which is "I would prefer not to." And I think that what we're describing is why he constantly returns to that, and even they have T-shirts with that now, because that's the real radicality of that idea, that instead of answering yes or no to any sort of question, that implies that either way we answer, you're subordinating yourself to some sort of outside authority that restricts your autonomy, that the only way to actually manifest any kind of actual freedom in that instance is to step back and even refuse to make any sort of choice at all. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my impression is that Zizek always advocating this idea of saying "I would prefer not to" is changing the coordinates. It's some way of expanding your own autonomy in contrast to some sort of authoritarian force, precisely by saying some particular thing that is, just basically saying I'm not even going to play this game. I'm asserting some new kind of paradigm in response to it.
Exactly. Like I'm not just going to cast myself as the embodiment of a unspoken for group just on account of its existence. I'm not going to participate in the ruling hegemonic idea of like how I should behave if I want to like properly integrate myself into culture. I'm going to fully basically sidestep both of those things and just move passionately toward the things that I believe in are justified or are relevant in today's society, that the things that do define me as a subject that have nothing to do with my enunciated position in society as like a subject of a certain category or type, but rather as like one that defines its own like subjective position given its own coordinates.
Theory level over 9,000. It was just achieved. But this is why I love that we're doing this. This is why, again, I was so excited for us to sit down and do a podcast on Zizek specifically, because these are the types of things that Zizek takes you into, the types of questions, the critiques. And I really don't know of where else you're going to find this sort of stuff today, particularly in a book about Lenin. But it seems so vital. It seems that this is exactly the kind of critique we have to be engaging in if we want to not just constantly be sort of perpetuating and remaking the ideological conditions of capital that have been in existence for at least, the last 30, 40 years, if not longer.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that is a part of this criticism that I'm about to go into here that I think is like rarely mentioned. And I think that it does have to do with this sort of like id pol perspective that a lot of people get sucked into, the debates back and forth about identity politics and its effectiveness. And like, I mean, the argument that he makes is that liberal ideology today fully relies on, or like at its heart, at its core, consists of the manipulations of this idea of freedom. right? That you as a subject have potentials in you to be free, but that you must engage with those potentials in the correct manner, right? Like quote unquote, be you, right? And this is like a big thing that Zizek's all about. I mean, he talks about the injunction to enjoy, which is everywhere. I mean, he always like talks about like Coca-Cola products, and they have that like motto, just like enjoy, in conjunction with this idea of like you're supposed to be unique and be an individual, that you yourself almost have to enjoy your symptomatic nature, right? Like that you're going to be some strange partial object that doesn't fit fully into any category, but that you're supposed to like revel in it. In this like very strange way, you become subjugated to capitalism and its influence over you in a way that you absolutely are not free to choose unless you buy your freedom on the market, right? Unless you buy that identity from the catalog that capitalism presents you with, right? Like which freedom do you like? Which one do you want to choose? And your identity is absolutely for sale. Markets are emerging everywhere that not only are trying to sell you an identity, but even preemptively like giving you this preemptive idea that you are full of potentials that you haven't realized yet. And I think that this is kind of where Zizek goes with it. He says, everything's presented to you as a new unlocked potential, like healthcare, like, oh, should it be universalized? Like, no, that would be restrictive of freedom. You as a subject should be able to choose which healthcare you want.
I just heard a clip from a PragerU video about this earlier, which is this is the exact conservative criticism of Medicare for All, is that it is going to restrict your freedom precisely because the government can't do what the market and private companies can do better because they grant you more choice.
Yeah, and it's like that underpinning of freedom being like the most important thing that anyone could ever have, while simultaneously denying you any kind of real freedom to do anything meaningful, is like the core of liberal ideology, right? He talks about like temp work, right? Like no one can get a steady job because we're all just like competing with each other for the same jobs, and like the temp work and like redefining yourself, right? Like having the perspective of yourself as like an entrepreneur, right? Even though you only have like, $500 in your account or something like that, like you're supposed to be reinvesting that in the new projects of the future you that's going to like be successful and like take advantage of those like skills that are locked, that potential that's locked inside of you, that you have the freedom to like employ in the ways that you want, even though you're like fully subjugated. Like if you don't make your job and you get fired, like you're not going to pay your rent, you're going to be like out on your ass, but you have so much unlocked potential, and that's just a new opportunity, right? And so it's like this strange this like rebranding, right? Like that we all are supposed to, like, we're expected to do to ourselves.
Well,
so
I'm reminded of, just really quickly, I'm reminded of even back in the 50s, Erich Fromm was writing about this, and he called it the marketplace self. That even then, I think it's much more insidious and much more efficient and effective now, but even then, he was critiquing from a Marxist, not psychoanalytic in the same way that Zizek is, but still grounded in psychoanalysis, of saying, what we have to realize is part of what we're integrating ourselves into and how this is happening is that we are now the things that we're fashioning into commodities to sell on the market.
Yeah.
And I think in some ways Zizek really is extending that and being even more radical in his critique of how this functions.
Yeah, and it's absolutely, Erich Fromm also wrote Escape from Freedom, right?
Yeah.
And that's very much like it's funny because you receive it almost as a retort today. If like, not having healthcare and having job precarity and like being broke all the time and having your life be unpredictable because of those circumstances, if that makes you anxious, well then you probably just fear freedom, right? Like you want to escape from your free state in this like wonderful country of opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's just like this weird back-asswards way of conceiving of our subjective position today. And so Zizek talks about this psychological experiment that was, I think, organized by Jean-Léon Beauvoir. I'm not sure if he was actually the researcher or if he was just writing about it. I'm sure he was one of the researchers. But it's all about these paradoxes that arise when the freedom of choice is conferred on a subject. So basically, they had like two groups of participants that joined in a study, and they were informed that it would require for them to do something that they probably wouldn't like doing, that might even be like considered by them to be unethical. And so they have these two groups, and they tell one of the groups, you have the freedom to choose not to participate if you feel like you don't want to do that. And the other group, they just didn't mention that. They just said, well, now you're participating, like, let's go.
Mm-hmm.
What they found is that the, like, sort of conferring upon that one group that they had the choice not to participate if they wanted to not participate did not change the outcome almost at all of how many people decided to participate, even though they knew they might be subject to something that they might consider unethical. He basically says that the granting of the freedom of choice to not do something doesn't actually, like, change the outcome of how many people will participate once they've already chosen. In fact, it's not just that it has no effect, but almost the opposite, that the people who were informed that they had the choice not to participate have a much more thorough way of justifying their participation.
Whereas because they can conceptualize that they had some
autonomy that they chose. They think that they chose to do something there. They conceive of themselves as having chosen, so they sort of retroactively create in their heads some justification as to why. And the researcher actually, like, enumerates this. Beauvoir, he talks about these 3 different modes of the justification for their participation, right? Mm-hmm. The other group he kind of attributed to, like, well, they just saw themselves as being committed to something, and so they didn't consider it like a choice of theirs. But then the other group has these three categories, right? One he calls authoritarian. Like an authoritarian justification for why they did it, which they just felt that they were commanded to on the threat of, like, punishment or on the reward of possibly gaining something from the authority figure that commanded them. There's what he calls totalitarian justification, which, like, those people felt compelled to participate on account of, like, some higher motivation, like common good, or some, like, ideological perspective they might have on what they might contribute to society.
So some higher ideal or something.
Yeah, like an idealistic, like, necessity. Okay. Right. And then the third version is what he calls the liberal justification. He kind of describes it as, like, the appeal to that inner potential that people have. Like, it's like a naturalization of, like, well, this was probably always in me to do, you know, like, say they try to get you to eat a worm, you know, that, like, people might say, like, well, you know, it's only natural, worms are full of protein, and, like, who knows, maybe I'll actually like them, and, like, who cares about society's ideals? Like, eating worms could be great for me. This is something that I should try, and just step out of my own comfort zone and try it, right? And like the potential of personal discovery or something like that.
It's almost like it's a potential that you have within yourself that you discover by having it posed to you in this particular way.
Absolutely, okay. Yeah. And so then Zizek criticizes the perspectives. Obviously, he never accepts anything as it's given.
Of course he's going to criticize it.
So he actually says, like, no, there's no such thing as, like, a pure authoritarian impulse or like authoritarian rule over an individual. Like, it's like even the most brutal regimes of, like, dictatorship and stuff like that, they never outwardly presented themselves as, like, if you disobey you will be murdered. I mean, there's, like, maybe back in, like, the Middle Ages or something, but, like, he says always those threats are veiled. They're sort of like something that is to be implied from the commands to obey, but never explicitly used to invoke the fear, you know, of, like, if I don't obey, bad things will come. And he says generally those things are implicit to people's interpretation. And he kind of says that in totalitarianism, or, like, what we contemporarily conceive of totalitarianism as, people are oppressed, like, on account of a higher moral standard, yes, but it's for their own good. Like, it's for the good of the people a lot of the time. Even if it punishes them, it's for that ideal, right? So he was kind of saying that totalitarian perspective is actually something that most of the time is mediated by what this researcher is calling liberalism, right? Or, like, this liberal justification that, like, most of the time totalitarianism, or, like, these ideals that justify people's subjugation, are actually sort of mediated through it being for their own good, or, like, promoting the choices of individuals, or, like, promoting the potentials of individuals, even if it's literally against their will to do so. That, like, they always appeal to that kind of perspective. So anyway, Zizek is just, he's criticizing these breakdown of, like, these nice, neat 3 categories. He kind of says, well, these sort of all overlap in a way. Yeah. Especially in today's world, you don't generally find totalitarianism as, like, devoid of some approach to appeasing the masses on account of the injustices that totalitarianism causes. Today's totalitarianism is fully aware of, like, its injustices and tries to make appeals to the populations that it is, you know, unjust toward, on account of trying to keep them under the impression that there's some justification to the injustice, right? And he's saying you rarely find, like, authoritarianism in full blown in a full-blown sense. You always have it mediated once again through a subjective perspective, some kind of liberal engagement that it's for the good of people and not, there's always some ideological justification.
Well, I mean, very quickly, this does remind me of a lot of the sort of humanitarian liberal discourse that started out with people like the Ford Foundation and people in the 60s who were advocating for these sort of war on poverty programs or this sort of particular approach to combating poverty in communities of color. And I'm thinking of Daniel Moynihan. I mean, sometimes we forget about, like, Daniel Moynihan was he was just like straight up liberal. But his whole perspective was always that, we're implementing these programs, we're sort of changing policy, we're reshaping, we're trying to refashion these communities from from sort of this top-down perspective, precisely for the sake of unlocking their own potentials.
Yeah.
That was always the justification, and it still is today.
Yeah, and also Zizek has a caveat about the liberalism. I mean, he has like a thing that he always repeats in a lot of his lectures and stuff, where it's kind of the story of like the postmodern father versus the old school authoritarian father. Mm-hmm. And he talks about how the authoritarian father at least provided you with some coordinates that you could aim your anger at, or like some subject that you could confer that feeling of resentment toward. Like your authoritarian father would just be like, you're going to go see your grandma. I don't care if you're happy about it or you like it or not. You're going to have to go see her because it's your grandma. Sorry. You can be mad at me. Sorry.
Yeah.
And so at least he gave you some figure of an other that you could engage with as having subjugated you or like oppressed you in some way, right? But that the postmodern father is like much more insidious, that like they'd be like, now you know how much your grandmother loves you, and I can't make the decision for you, but I know that she would love it if you came and you visited. It's totally up to you. Like, your grandmother is there and you only have certain opportunities to see her, but I can't make the decision for you, right? And then so there's like this enormous amount of pressure that's put on you to make a certain particular kind of decision, but you don't, when you make it, the only person responsible for that decision and having made it is you. The thing that has basically caused this symbolic efficiency in you, or what Lacan would call symbolic efficiency, which is like the implication that you have to make a decision on account of some authority that has compelled you, but that the only decision that you really can make in response to that call is to acknowledge the authority and then take the responsibility onto yourself.
Yeah,
which is like this way worse type of situation than the authoritative one that allows you to be devoid of the responsibility for having to participate, but also doesn't subject you to the responsibility for the outcome of the thing you chose.
Yeah,
right?
Would you also say that
they chose for you?
Would it almost be that to then decide not to go to your grandmother's house, you would kind of in some ways be betraying your own internal motivations and drives to then not go through with that decision?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think that the postmodern father would then turn around and like whip you into submission because you decided against it. They're going to be like, well, it's your decision.
Well, I imagine
you failed in that decision, it'll be just like exactly the same pressure and the exact same anxiety of like, well, did I make the wrong choice? But fully put into you in a way that takes no responsibility for having caused the initial conundrum in the first place, right?
I almost imagine that part of the effect of that is no longer any kind of like anger or rage against this outside authority, but is internalized as guilt or shame. Something like that, guilt of like your own betrayal of your own motivations and drives and the things that you should feel.
Yeah. And so then Zizek enters into discussion of Lacan, where he's talking about the master signifier and this idea of symbolic efficiency. He kind of talks about these three sort of versions of authority, like once again liberalism, which he considers like the most insidious of all of these, that sort of authoritarianism, which we kind of don't find anymore, and that he kind of talks about how, like, once again, liberal ideology today at its core is the manipulation of this idea of your own potential and your own freedom, right? And so he's basically saying that the type of situation that we're in today is so problematic because, in a sense, the choice that we have made about which authority we accepted is specifically the one that sort of naturalizes all of our forced choices back into ourselves. So we sort of become like the exhaust pipes of capitalist production, right? And like we are the mechanism through which it derives all of its authority, and we are simultaneously the object that experiences all of the wear and tear of its like gears grinding, right? That like the proliferation of like psychological health problems, like our dependence on like pharmaceutical industry to like get us through our day, influence of like quote unquote narcotics, like, you know, insidious drugs that are supposedly illicit, and like, you know, all of these things, the emotional burdens that like our relationships suffer on account of the grinding out of the gears of capitalism through our literal like taking responsibility for everything that it causes, through this sort of relation between subject and subjugated, right? Or like between like this sort of symbolic efficiency, or the efficiency of this call that is being made to us to acknowledge an authority that we accept in this format through which we naturalize our own choices without acknowledging that an authority compelled us to.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this, I was just writing on this on the blog that I have in one of the recent pieces, but I think sort of the really materialist factor in this too, which is really fascinating, that William Davies writes a lot about, is how this off-putting, or this sort of subjugation in this particular way through this kind of like postmodern father kind of approach, seems to correspond very closely with the shift from labor being much more material to moving towards a much more intellectual, sort of psychological form of labor. Mm-hmm. And you see that the way that Davies describes it is the injuries that typically came from women, young children, you know, able-bodied men working in factories, and the amount of injuries, the deaths, all these kind of things. Once you shift over to intellectual labor, those same injuries are present. They just shift into the realm of the psychological, depression, anxiety.
Absolutely.
You know, all these different factors. So it's a really interesting kind of materialist factor here of how this shift happens, and, you know, another piece of the puzzle, I think.
Yeah, man. I think in a lot of ways, I mean, I'm glad that Zizek actually cited like some psychological research. I feel like all the time he's just a lot more like, you know, I'm going to float around and just pontificate about things.
Yeah.
I'll say that there are sources for the things that I'm claiming, but I'm not necessarily going to cite them until some other time in the book. And
yeah, and usually they're a very strange interpretation of his own interpretation of those sources too.
Yeah, so I really like this. I know he's criticizing it all to hell, like whatever conclusions this researcher made, but
it's very productive though.
It is. It's an interesting take on like these traditional coordinates of authority that we all have, you know, like, you know, most people conceive of like a liberal democracy as like the pinnacle of freedom in modern society, that, mm-hmm. you know, we're allowed to participate in our representative system of government, and like, you know, our needs are being accounted for, and, you know, we have freedoms that are not granted onto a lot of other people in the world who don't, you know, have the same forms of government. We have to spread that democracy
with,
you know, through
bombs
and guns. And so it just very quickly becomes problematic. I guess you could say non-philosophically grounded. What did we say earlier?
Yeah, I think non-philosophically grounded. Yes.
But so, yeah, he goes on to say that like at what he's, because he was making this point about really existing socialism, right? And that mm-hmm. it's a signal of its defeat that the only thing that we can really say about it is like, look, it's there, you know, like, come on, you can't ignore it. It's there. Something happened. He's kind of saying, well, at what point, you know, after the like 89 sort of like this collapse of Eastern Bloc mm-hmm. type really existing socialisms, during their dissolution, at what point were they given that consent that they could decline to participate? Right? Like this mm-hmm. researcher did, kind of like, weren't they sort of captivated almost immediately by the potential of the new choices in the new paradigm that that they were going to participate in? You know, like, should we be like conservative nationalists? Should we be sort of like a liberal progressive, you know, pure progressive type country? Like, I don't think at any point in time there was really that break, that official break that like Lenin was encountering, of like the emancipatory potential of being liberated, right, from the clutches of communism, or like this old world style of organizing themselves politically, and for them, you know, for them to actually consider like, oh, well, what could be done now? Like, what new way could we choose to organize ourselves? Well, no, it was immediately, it was like, well, now we're in liberal democracy and capitalism, or as though there was no transition, or we stay with the old way. Yeah, or
in a situation in Russia, you have essentially the sort of IMF, like World Bank, like the Western Chicago school shock troops of free markets coming in and just ruthlessly just obliterating whatever social forms were left for the complete reconstruction of entire like free market society. And I don't know, it's one of those pieces of history that I think is very easy to lose and to overlook, is the brutality in which capitalism was implemented in Russia precisely after the wall fell and after the collapse of the Soviet blocs.
Yeah. He goes on to say that we have to kind of turn back to Lenin, return to Lenin's insights, right? About formal and actual freedom, probably coming from his reading of Hegel's logic, right? That actual freedom has to sort of break the seduction of symbolic efficiency, once again, to like sort of posit its own coordinates for which choices it has and what opportunities are available for it to sort of like choose from. And he invokes all kinds of stuff. He talks about the Jacobins again. He talks about John Brown and like the emancipatory potential of a figure like John Brown, which I'm not planning to go really into, but I mean, there's so many insights, so many like historical references that he makes to justify all these claims. We just don't really, I feel like we don't have time to go through all of them without being here for 10 hours.
But in general, would you say that Zizek is citing that these are also figures, moments in history whenever these things happen, these people engaged in some sort of action that did reposit new coordinates in some way?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And then he kind of goes on to make a further claim that there's a degree to which radicalism, or like some kind of excessive form of radicalism, not just like, oh, well, we want to create an alternative to the paradigm, but like fully like trying to be outside of even those alternatives to the paradigm, that like some excessive forms of radicalism generally represent a reactionary impetus of our contemporary society, where we are unable to really engage with the most basic tenets of our societal organization and capitalism. Like, we can't deal with the problems of private property. We can't deal with the sort of personal freedoms that we'd be infringing upon, those freedoms that, universal healthcare would stomp all over, or whatever that people have, to the point where all we get is like this reactionary impotence of like, I'm more radical than thou, I refuse your perspective. And that this is always a sign of like, the inability to engage with this actual freedom that's being proposed by Lenin via Hegel, that like we can't change those coordinates, or we can't address those most basic building blocks of the society that we live in. And so all we get is like tear shit up, fuck everything, complete anarchy, and like complete perspective of like non-acknowledgement of any of these rules or of any of these masters.
So you're saying this is Limp Bizkit in a nutshell. Limp Bizkit was really an instantiation of the impotence of the revolutionary impulse.
Limp Bizkit,
give me something to break. Come on.
Give me something to break. I'm also thinking about Nookie. I don't know. Maybe it's just like
the entire Limp Bizkit catalog.
These are the only songs that anybody ever listened to.
Yeah.
Come on, let's be honest. Rollin'. That was that one.
That's true, yeah.
So yeah, let's see. I have a quote written down here. Let's see if it's worth saying. It's kind of talking about idea of excessive radicalism and the sort of reactionary impotence in this inability to engage with like the sort of material tenets of our societal organization, right? And I think that one of the things that I think is really interesting that Zizek suggests here toward the end of this section on Leninist freedom is that maybe if we turn around the sort of coordinates of this freedom, right, this idea of internal subjective freedom that we have that's like so well manipulated by our like capitalist ideology today, that like there might be some emancipatory potential in it that he kind of talks about. I'm like not sure if I should just read the whole quote, or I'll summarize what I think he means here.
Yeah, go for it.
That it's not so much that that the totalitarian impulse of capital today is the dominance of like material production and technology over intersubjectivity, but rather that the root also the root of political terror is not in the idea that instrumental reason is being imposed on the subject, but rather the opposite. Maybe what we really need is to turn these ideas on their head and to deny the autonomy or the subjectivity of material production. Like you have this topic today of like, companies, corporations are people, and, sort of like the autonomy of material production can never be infringed upon in our society, saying maybe if we were to deny the material production its autonomy and subjugate it to political logic, that we would sort of be reversing this role, right, of like us being subjectivized by our sort of objective rulers, right, and sort of being turned into these certain particular types of subjects through the like manipulation of our freedoms. Like, what if there was like a full denial of the sort of freedom and the autonomy of the basis of material production from which this power comes down upon us, right? And we sort of subjugated. Like, why aren't we voting over like what the money that like companies are massively making hand over fist selling their products, like what the money gets invested, where that money goes? Like you look at any school program in the United States right now and you'll see that like the arts are suffering. There are cuts in funding for all kinds of things other than like, I feel like STEM programs have a lot of money because they generate scientists that are going to like build the bombs, which is like
or
horrible.
innovate new products, create
Yeah,
new medicines,
capital.
things that, it's the technological sort of impetus that capital has to continue to innovate. And then it funnels resources into those things that are going to innovate and help increase profits.
Right, like IT, the development of like apps, like those kinds of skills are highly valued. But practical skills that are going to like allow you to sort of just live your life and have some success and not be broke for the rest of it are like just completely neglected. And I don't know. So I think it's an interesting idea, like what is it to recreate? What is to recreate emancipatory terror? I mean,
that's
is
the question
what
of the day.
Like, this is a quote from him. The problem here is not terror as such. Our task today is precisely to reinvent emancipatory terror. It's kind of what I just said here. He just says, what if political terror, quote unquote, signals precisely that the sphere of material production is denied in its autonomy and subordinated to political logic? Is it not that political terror, from the Jacobins to Mao's Cultural Revolution, presupposes the foreclosure of production proper, its reduction to the terrain of political battle? In other words, what it amounts to is nothing less than the abandonment of Marx's key insight into how political struggle is a spectacle which, in order to be deciphered, has to be referred to the sphere of economics. If Marxism had any analytical value for political theory, was it not in the insistence that the problem of freedom was contained in the social relations implicitly declared unpolitical, that is, naturalized in liberal discourse? Yeah, he kind of says Lenin courageously confronted this key point in his last years. I don't know. I think that's kind of speaks for itself. It's like a strong statement to make, but I think that, he's just once again trying to like encourage the recontextualization of some of the like contemporary perspectives on what needs to be implemented in order for successful leftist progress or leftist movements. And maybe it's something that appears very different, or like has a very different embodiment than what we typically imagine it to be, right?
What I think is really interesting is how often you see the guillotine showing back up in meme culture and protests, right? Like the yellow vest protests in France, but even in some of the ones in the States that have happened, there are these memes that come out about it, or pictures of people building their own guillotines and showing up, or like putting them across the street from like a major investment firm or a banking building, and there's a guillotine on the roof. And I just find it in some way kind of a weird sort of hearkening back even to what Zizek was talking about even a year ago. It isn't that we're talking about this sort of impulse of the masses, let's say the exploited, oppressed masses, towards some sort of radical emancipatory project. The thing that it's sort of being symbolized by is a return to the symbol of the Jacobin terror, which is the guillotine. And I think that it's just sort of a weird kind of symptom of this exact kind of process.
Yeah.
It's
just vengeance almost, or like some kind of like pure chaos through which we can all enact our feelings of inadequacy in the face of this unfolding of capital. We want to fuck shit up too, capital. Like almost like some kind of weird. Yeah. It's like when you misperceive how power is organized in its oppression of you or its dominance over you, you tend to repeat that same power structure in your own approach to like your own life. It's almost like we can't think outside of that paradigm. Like even when governments collapse and we have like revolts or protests that like in France, like what you're talking about, like this could be happening maybe, but I just not from what I've been reading. But what you hear about is the rioting in the streets and fighting police, and you see videos of like people setting things on fire and tearing down things, and guillotines, and just like yellow vests mobbing police and stuff. And I think that's great, but there's no, like, please believe me.
These
like,
are positive changes.
It warms my cockles. But like, it's devoid of like any, it doesn't feel like there's a movement or a project being built. It just feels like we're going to fuck shit up until you do something to make us stop, which I don't feel like lends itself to some kind of ongoing project that's going to turn into like an emancipatory shift away from capital. Much rather, it's like, if we destroy enough of your property, you'll get pissed off and you'll concede to some of our demands in like a compromised way, and then we'll eventually do this enough to where we just subside and we no longer have any impulse to like revolt. And that's very saddening to me. I feel like when you have that many people involved, and and if this is just like a Eurocentric perspective, I mean, there's lots of instances of this that have been happening all over, like in the Middle East, in South America, Venezuela, like all this shit, like it's happening all over the place, right? But there's no cohesion. It doesn't seem like there's like some kind of central reference point that all of these movements can orient themselves toward, or like any central project that's really taking advantage of these disparate revolts that are happening in lots of different places. It's almost as though their own revolts in their own localities are just appealing to their authority, to like almost like begging, like, please just give us something so that we can, not have a reason to be out here in the streets, any old thing. And it's like, if the pressure is high enough, you can kind of offer whatever. Yeah, I don't know. There's potential to those revolutionary sort of moments in their own localities, but I just don't feel like there's an overarching solidarity necessarily to them.
Well, I'm reminded
that has material content. Obviously, ideologically, we're all in solidarity, right? But
yeah.
What does that materially mean?
Well, I'm actually reminded of a chapter of a title in Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism, and it's something that has really stuck with me whenever I think about any sort of manifestation of protest culture. And the chapter title is, what if you had a protest and everyone showed up? That if the idea is that essentially we just need to get X number of people there, and then somehow this revolutionary project will somehow manifest of its own nature. Even just his very pithy chapter title was trying to somehow offer a critique of this, that, the importance of protest culture, whatever is there, is not in just how many people are showing up, millions in, Syntagma Square, how many people showed up in Tahrir Square or wherever it was. It has to be that there's some sort of project that can unify and provide solidarity across borders, across boundaries. And without that, you're left with nothing but some weird kind of performative spectacle that is only determined by how many people show up. I mean, we only need to talk about like the Women's March, the pro-science march, and this sort of, it's almost as if we can't think of any other way to engage outside of just these huge spectacles of movements and however many people we can show up.
Yeah, it's definitely one of our major stumbling blocks today, is that there doesn't seem to be, there's plenty of momentum, but there doesn't seem to be enough momentum enough momentum in the direction of like establishing something that's going to last beyond just the revolt, right? Like the morning after the revolution, right? And I mean, that's specifically what Lenin was dealing with in these last few years of his life, right? Like that's what he was, struggling with. And I think, once again, he had all kinds of like strange conceits. Like, I don't think he really understood exactly what to make of it. He let me see here. Like I was saying before, he kind of had that, I don't know, just like go to work and obey at work, and then we can debate on the weekends kind of thing. And it's interesting because Zizek makes the point in the reading. He said, well, there's no wonder why Western liberals loved workers' councils. It was like this perfect compromise of like, just obey, do your work, and like you guys can have like some autonomy as like a collective of workers. And like everyone adopted this. He was like saying like Hannah Arendt, even people who weren't socialists were like, yeah, this is great. And so, I don't know, it's just interesting. The self-transparent organization of the masses of workers is like, he kind of says it's like this perverse repetition of the faith that people had in the idea that like a effective bureaucratic organization could be developed that was also transparent in that same way, that like it would have accountability, and that it's also the same kind of sort of pipe dream, that like it doesn't actually amount to anything other than like a deeper exploitation of the very same nature of like what was originally trying to be critiqued, he kind of goes on to finish this section by just once again reiterating that he thinks that like Lenin and the perspective that Lenin had given his time and what he was going through around 1917 was very similar to what we're experiencing now. And we can learn a lot from this. I mean, I know we're just kind of coming back to this point, but I'm trying to like sort of wrap this up, short of, I mean, there's like a whole nother section about Zizek sort of proposes, he goes into the university discourse, hysterics discourse, all of these ideas that are proposed by Lacan as like ways that authority and its subjects interact.
How would you translate those to, in just a real kind of even just straightforward way, just so, a listener who isn't familiar with Lacan in any respect can get some sense of what those mean?
Yeah, basically Lacan has something he calls the four discourses. And so you have the discourse of the master, which is just basically like the authority that subjugates. It's almost like the authoritarian category that we were talking about before, where it's like just punishment versus reward. The master discourse doesn't necessarily like appear as a pure master discourse in our global capitalist society now. We actually have it split into two sort of opposing discourses because of the intervention of the discourse of the hysteric. And so the discourse of the hysteric is like, the hysterical in Freud is sort of like this angry questioning of authority, of like, what authority do you have to impose on me, or why is it that you say I am what I am, or like, what is it that makes me your subject? The Zizek is actually interesting because like I feel like it was in fashion a while back to argue that like perversion was like the appropriate type of subjectivity that we needed to have against hysteria. But like in a sense, Zizek regularly argues that like the hysterics discourse is a much more emancipatory perspective to have, like to question authority and to call out the legitimacy of like an authority figure that tries to impose on you. He says with the sort of constant revealing of the master's false authority by the hysteric, you have the master discourse of capitalism appear in like this twofold sort of parallax format, where you have the hysteric and you have the response of the master, which is to resort to what's called university discourse, which we kind of mentioned briefly earlier.
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
The university discourse is where the master takes the perspective of like, oh, I don't make the rules. I'm just stating facts. This is not up to me. There's like some
objectivity.
Yeah, some objectivity, some factual foundation upon which I have the authority, and it's not up to me even. It's just something objective.
We would say Neil deGrasse Tyson is sort of the perfect embodiment of university discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's to his own benefit, right? Because if they have all the answers and no one else can get them, then, you know, it creates that sort of like relationship of necessity, right? And like, it's the perfect cover for brutal interventions of war and things like that in around the world. Like, well, if we don't do it, then we know through our logistical research that this thing will happen, and well, it's not up to us. We have to do it. You know, it's like the perfect cover for like a brutal authority to be able to say like, well, it's not up to me.
Well, and I think too, there's also a way that the university discourse is the perfect way to describe sort of liberal centrist technocratic culture today.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like, oh, we know that these programs work because we means tested them. We know that this is going to happen because we've run all these scientific polls, and we can give you objective facts. And then whenever something happens like Trump, completely undermines all the legitimacy of that particular kind of discourse.
Yeah, and then you have weird stuff like alternate facts and like sort of fake news and all these like strange like reactionary responses to like this sort of crisis of like, well, where do we get our information from? If we can't trust these sources, then what? You know, it's like, ugh, it's disgusting. But anyway,
it's gross.
It's gross. Shit's weak. Zizek talks about how if it is true that our contemporary master's discourse appears in this particular way as like a split between a university discourse and a hysterics discourse, right? Like the interplay between those two discourses, like the questioning of the hysteric being answered by the like the sort of cold facticity of like the university discourse. He kind of says, shouldn't we then oppose this like university / hysterical discourse with their opposites, which in that sort of those four coordinates that I was saying before that Lacan came up with, you have master, university, hysterical, and then the last one is the discourse of the analyst. And the analyst is like, you could say it's like the embodiment of like psychoanalysis as a discursive strategy that like pits the presuppositions of the analysand against their own actions and their own appraisal of their own situation, circumstance, in order to try to elicit in them some readjustment or some recoordination of those ideas. But it can be done in lots of ways, sort of like through trickery or like through sort of like double entendre or through like symbolic coincidence and things like that. So it's like a type of authority in the sense of like a master or a university discourse, but it's not one that relies on, it does rely on a certain kind of distance to the subject, but it doesn't rely on like some basis of authority that is factual or truthful. It just pits the individual against themselves almost, or it pits the subject against itself and sort of plays you against your own ideas or your own critical remarks about your own circumstances, whatever, so and so.
Which I imagine to some degree, just to come back to this, a successful analysis would have to cause the subject to reimagine their own coordinates in a way. Right. Would you say that's the case?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's definitely, I think, one of the goals of analysis is to like make some kind of headway into the perspective that you feel like you're locked in due to possibly traumas you've suffered or due to circumstances you're still currently facing, or, you know, like as an individual, you know, a lot of things converge on what you are, like who you are, what you're supposed to be. And I think that because of the deadlocks of like things that have defined us from the past and, you know, just in general, like our perspective on what is wrong with us, what's wrong with others, we can get locked into certain ways of thinking about our own potentials, and like those potentials are still there despite us not seeing them, you know. And so I think in a lot of ways, getting people to understand that they're not bound necessarily, even though they fully find their own identity in something that has like that allows them no space or no power to act, they aren't necessarily bound by those coordinates. And if they are, they only are insofar as those coordinates provide the grounds for them to move forward.
Well, I mean, in some way, I'm just kind of, if we're come to a close here, I guess what I'm kind of taking from all of this is that what we take from Lenin being read in this particular way is some sort of framework for what would it look like for someone in this particular revolutionary situation with this particular project to engage in this process.
Well, so just to finish this little line of thought that we were going on with the discourses, Zizek basically sort of proposes that a solution to or like a counterpoint to the sort of hysterical university split that we see in the Master Discourse in Capitalism, that it could be opposed by a master / analyst discourse as its opposite, that like you would have a master, but not the stupid like Jordan Peterson regression into like traditional authority. That's not what he's talking about. He means something more like a master that is an authority, but not one that disciplines and prohibits, but one that grants you back your own subjective autonomy to do what you want and to pursue the things that you might desire to pursue, not one that's going to set all the rules and like, you know, prohibit you from wearing those red shoes that you like, or
one that wants to tell you to stand up straight and clean your room.
Oh yeah. Just that's a whole nother, we'll maybe have that discussion one day and vent all our frustrations about this moronic.
Well, I think at some point we're going to have to do a special episode and we're going to read through the 12 rules for life or whatever.
Please, can we do that?
Yeah, I think we need to do that. And we'll read it specifically in this Lacanian, like Zizekian way. That's going to be...
all wear our lobster claws.
Yeah.
Talk of that Jordan Peterson. But yeah, so, you know, and then that master would be supplemented by, in order to sort of prohibit this authoritarian impulse that generally we find when you have so much of an authoritative presence embodied in like one central figure of authority, we generally have abuses of power, right? And so Zizek suggests that there would be like a supplemental discourse of the analyst that would be pitting the decisions or the authority of that master against itself, so that it would be subject to its own sort of authoritative impulses as well as the people that it's subjugated. So this could sort of like break us out of the deadlock of like, oh, I have no choice, and like, oh, but then what's your, you know, what gives you the right, and oh, I have no choice, and we move into something more like, oh, well, now I have authority and I grant unto you autonomy, but if I abuse my authority, then I'm also abusing my own, you know, I'm also abusing my own position from which I enunciate the authority. And so I think it's really interesting. He also talks about how Lenin proposed, like right before his death, the CCC, the Central Commission, or the Central Control Commission, which in a sense is really strangely kind of an analyst committee to sort of keep checks on the party. And like it's a drawn out thing, but he had a few tenets. He said he insisted on full sovereignty for the national entities that composed the Soviet state. This is Lenin in his demands. The modesty of goals, that we shouldn't just have like lofty goals like socialism, but like more direct goals that we could like effectively manage, you know, like developing an effective technocratic or like an effective bureaucracy, basically. He wanted an emphasis on civility and politeness. I mean, he was like deeply offended when Lenin like insulted his wife, and I think there was like a fight that happened in one of the committee meetings or something. I don't know. And it doesn't mean that he went soft, right? Like he wasn't like just like fully backing off of this revolutionary impulse. He still at the time, you know, invoked that, you know, despite what the NEP thought, they could still invoke the terror if things didn't go the way that they wanted them to. So, I mean, he definitely was still of a revolutionary mind during this time. He wasn't conceding anything. And then he wanted the CCC specifically to perform checks and balances on the party, on the Soviet party. And he kind of said that it could be implemented through trickery or through deception, and that they had to be kind of a disembodied organism, or like a disembodied organization that wouldn't be subordinated to the authority of the party. And so like it's just interesting. It's almost like he had this kind of insight of what could lend itself to providing checks on the kind of power that he was observing as it developed during this time. And
at this point, I mean, in some very strange sort of, I almost want to say uncanny kind of way, he's understanding in his own time and his own conditions and through his own limitations that what was needed was this sort of strangely Lacanian kind of psychoanalytic process to happen precisely to check the master discourse just being completely unchecked and running amok. I mean, I imagine we would have to say that, show trials and all these other things are precisely whenever you see like the master discourse as Lacan describes it, just completely unhinged and untethered.
Just to conclude, I mean, we didn't go as much into like the dialectical nature of like the different Lenins through history, sure. There's a lot to this introduction. I mean, despite it only being like 80 pages.
This is just the introduction.
This is the introduction. We didn't even get to the text, which is like the meat of the book. Like the Lenin text. It's a super fruitful read, just the little 80 pages that Zizek uses to introduce these writings. I think it's really interesting. We didn't get as much to the Stalin and the Lenin back and forth that he goes into in great detail. But I think one thing I wanted to pull out was a quote that Zizek cites, and it's from Kafka, of all people, which is interesting. And it goes back to what I was saying kind of toward the beginning of when we started talking about all this, how there's like that sense of the tragic turn from like the hero versus the villain between Lenin and Stalin, and the hero sort of seeing his progeny sort of go in a direction he can no longer control, and just desperately desiring for it to go in a different direction. This is the quote from Kafka. The animal wrests the whip from its master and whips itself in order to become master, not knowing that it is only a fantasy produced by a new knot in the master's whiplash. And he says, is this remark by Kafka not the most succinct definition of what went wrong in the communist states of the 20th century? It's a productive and insightful perspective on Lenin. It really does, I think, succeed in kind of redeeming some of that revolutionary or like emancipatory potential in Lenin without resorting to like some kind of idyllic veneration of him that is disproportionate to the circumstances that he found himself in. And there's another quote here toward the end that apparently Lenin liked to quote. I was not really aware of this, but Lenin liked to quote Napoleon. And I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but it's like, on s'engage, et puis on le verra, but I think ultimately what it means, right? Yeah, like what? I don't know. I don't think I pronounced it correctly, but it basically means like, let's fight, or like, let's go ahead and just do it, like go forward with it, and then we'll see what happens. Like we'll see how the outcome turns out. And he sort of counterposes that to the Maoist slogan, like dare to fight, dare to win. Yeah. Right. It's almost like dare to fight, but like you can't really be sure what the hell's going to happen when you fight. So we should just fight, like let's not make any promises to anyone about what's going to happen in the end. Cause if not, we're going to be in this fiasco of like who said what. And if it's like the genealogy of the new communist, narrative and history and all that shit. Yeah. That's revisionist shit. But this is after like a long passage where he's basically saying Badiou was wrong. So I'm not going to get into it.
It sounds like standard Zizek,
friendly rivalry that just never seems to end. But anyway, I think just overall, if we can, say anything about this, it's a really fresh perspective on Lenin. There's obviously a lot more there that we didn't get to, but it's really interesting perspective to take, especially given the contemporary situation on the left. And I think it's definitely a relevant read for people if they're interested. Yeah. And hopefully we disambiguated at least some of it for those that can't, or for those that, or didn't know if they're interested or not. So.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think if there's anything to take from this particular book and this particular discussion, I would say, absolutely trying to disambiguate some of these things that I think in Zizek even, and I think he's a fairly accessible starting point for things like Lacan, but even then it can be very challenging. So hopefully, what you take from this is, wow, this stuff is difficult, but it's incredibly important to read, and even if you don't agree with it, to at least grapple with it, because these are some of the most interesting and I think at least most relevant contemporary ways to try to engage with the history of communist and socialist thinkers and revolutionaries, and to engage with them in a way that is sort of like what you were saying, which is having such veneration for them that we're willing to ruthlessly critique them and understand their limitations. And if there's anything that we need now more than ever, I think it's that.
Yeah. And I mean, if this inspired you to look into something that Zizek might have written, there's also, there's one for everyone, right? He has like an introduction on like a Trotsky book. He has an introduction on like On Contradiction from Mao, I'm pretty sure. Yeah. And all of those introductions are actually like really interesting, and do a similar thing where they're trying to find the coordinates of those figures in their time and to pull out from their legacy something emancipatory that can still be invested in. And I know, like, me saying Trotsky is probably like people that are just like sharpening their axes, but like, I think that
the pickaxes are being sharpened.
Yeah,
I can hear them now.
That's what I meant, pickaxes. And so like, or ice picks. That's
oh
right.
yeah,
That
that's
was
right.
ice
Yeah,
pick.
that's right. We got it eventually.
We'll just edit that out.
Yeah, we'll just cut all of those out. Yeah.
It'll be like ice pick, like in the wrong tone of voice. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, man. Do you have any like closing remarks? Like, what did you? Was there anything you wanted to, like, any criticisms?
I guess to wrap up, I could imagine a lot of people who typically read Lenin encountering this particular approach and finding it very strange and bizarre, and almost, I could see some people being like, why read Lenin this way? This is a distraction. This is obviously just academic bullshit. But I think that for me, what is so crucial here is that Zizek is taking very seriously a question that I think is not taken nearly seriously enough, which is there is no world communist revolution that happened. It didn't happen. It failed. Whatever attempted was failed. And I think that we have to be really serious about that. And disagree with Zizek all you want, but you have to respect the fact that he's trying to understand why that happened and trying to reinvigorate some idea of communism, socialism, whatever you want to call it, that can somehow understand the conditions that we're in and to find some way forward. Because the truth is that very few of us, if any of us, actually have an idea of what is the way forward now. And I think in some ways it's precisely because he can be so divisive and so polemical and be very strange and hyperbolic.
Yeah.
It's almost like that's precisely why we need to read him. That's precisely why we need to take seriously what he's trying to say and to not dismiss him as just some sort of, the Elvis of philosophy who's just, he has his weaknesses and his things that are very frustrating and he can be very repetitive. But, in the midst of all this is something I think that is absolutely a breath of fresh air, especially if all you've spent your time doing is reading Lenin, Stalin, Mao, in the spirit of all of those thinkers. If we're not engaging with the current traditions of philosophy and theory and what they're trying to do and what they're answering by, we're not even doing what Lenin and Mao were doing. So if nothing else, there's kind of an embodiment of that spirit that I think Zizek is trying to represent. And I don't know, I appreciate the hell of it. Appreciate you doing this episode and just doing all of this work.
Oh yeah, man. I love Zizek. Like I said, I love reading it. I think he always has really impressive insights, even if maybe he's fallen out of favor with a contemporary judgmental like op-ed culture of leftism today. I think that if I had anything to say to that particular group of people is like, maybe not that the sound bites don't matter, not that the statements he's made or like the positions he's taken on certain contemporary debates in popular culture aren't important or don't say anything about him as a thinker. I would urge those people who are critical of him to like actually read one of his serious theoretical works, whether it be like Parallax View or like Less Than Nothing,
Sublime Object of Ideology,
or even some
book.
of the older stuff that he's written, like The Puppet and the Dwarf and stuff like that, are still super relevant today. It's not like that's the one thing about Zizek is like I think that his theory and his perspective have endured over the last 20 or 30 years since he's been writing, and he's prolific. I mean, he's written so many books on so many topics. I'm sure there's something there that you would at least be somewhat motivated to read. And I think that it would recharacterize him from being like some kind of charlatan or like some kind of like oaf that just says dumb things and is really insensitive and aggressive with weird tics into somebody who's like, writing real theory that has had some semblance of consistency over like a large period of time, which he continues to write about. That being said, I don't know, man. I think we've done it.
Mission accomplished.
Mission accomplished. They're kicking down the door. Anyway.
Well, Comrade Alex, again, I mean, I was so happy to have you on. I think this was a great book to tackle. I couldn't think of a better person to have sort of been on for this particular work. And to really, we've done some history, we've done more sort of materialist historical analysis, but to really go completely a deep dive into some sort of theoretical work, I think this was the perfect start.
Yeah. I wanted to, I'm plugging right?
Do it, yeah.
So, I mean, it's not really a plug because it's just going to be us two again. So it's okay. I don't know if that's
We're
a plug.
going to plug
can
ourselves.
You plug yourself? It's
you
like
can.
when you, dude, no, it's really how it is. When you watch actual like network television nowadays, I feel like I talked to you about this, but like the only commercials that you see on networks, like if you watch CNN, for example, if you watch CNN for long enough, you realize like the only ads they have are for like pharmaceuticals, you know, and for their own network.
Oh, yeah.
They literally are just advertising for themselves, you know? It's just like the pharmaceutical lobby and then their own channel and the other shows that they have on their own channels. It's very weird.
Well, in that spirit, let's plug the next
ourselves.
show that you're going to be on.
So I hope to, the next time I'm here, talk about a book by Richard Prum that's called The Evolution of Beauty. Interesting book on biology about sexual selection and Darwin's theories of genetics and like how this is sort of a neglected aspect of biological research. It's really interesting, but I want to read it against Alenka Zupancic's What is Sex, which is a pretty new book that just came out.
Also sort of Lacanian psychoanalysis.
Lacanian psychoanalysis. Alenka Zupancic, I'm pretty sure, works pretty closely with Zizek a lot of the time on a lot of her projects, and Mladen Dolar is another one that's sort of in that group. But yeah, I think that the scope of her work, where she's kind of trying to recontextualize what the meaning of sex is in our contemporary society, not just like the act of coitus, but like sex as a like symbolic concept and like how it underpins a lot of our social relations and like the way that we conceive of power and all these different things. She kind of goes into it. And I think it'd be really interesting to read those things against each other. And I'd be really happy to come back and talk about that next time.
No, we're going to do it. And I'm pretty sure it's going to be epic.
Epic.
Yeah. All right. Well, Comrade Alex, thanks again for coming on. And we'll be doing that. And I imagine that might be a two-parter as well.
Absolutely. So that one probably. I mean, if this one was, then that one definitely is. And if this one wasn't, then still, that one definitely
will be, just to return back to what we were saying, this show is anti-hot take. We're all about ice-cold motherfucking takes, and I'm pretty sure that will be more of the same.
Yeah, I take my ice-cold motherfucker takes with ice, please, and ice on the side. So.
All right. All right, everyone, that does it for this two-parter episode on Slavoj Žižek's Lenin 2017 with Comrade Alex. You know, I'm a little biased here, but I would describe this one as being a real banger. I hope you would as well. And importantly, if this is your first time encountering some of the more theoretical work that Zizek does, I hope even if you didn't agree, you at least found yourself having to critically analyze, critically reflect on some of the deeper philosophical problems of being part of the leftosphere, especially if you consider yourself an admirer, a devotee of Lenin. And hopefully you're intrigued enough to maybe go read some of Zizek's other work, particularly his more theoretical work on Lacan, Marxism, and all that other good stuff. We mentioned it in episode 1, but if you're looking for a great place to start, any of his writings on film, such as Looking Awry, or even watching his film The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, which is a great introduction to his particular approach to analyzing film and connecting it up to ideology and capitalism and Marxist analysis. For the next couple of episodes, we're going to have Comrade Zoya on to talk about The Dialectic of Sex by Shulamith Firestone next week, and then the following week, Comrade Courtney is going to be on to talk about Adam Przeworski's fantastic book from 1984 called Capitalism and Social Democracy. I think that one will be especially relevant with the upcoming 2020 election, with AOC, with the rise of DSA, as it's a really brilliant historical analysis of the problematic relationship between electoral politics under capitalism and the role of democratic socialists historically and how they've tried to grapple with that. So until then, please keep supporting the show by liking us on Facebook, giving us a review on iTunes. Feel free to head over to Patreon, throw us a few bucks if you'd like to, and most importantly, invite your friends to like the page, share it around, lure some strangers into a room, lock them in there, and play any of our episodes over some sort of loudspeaker system to help politically indoctrinate them. You know, whatever it is that we feel needs to be done to increase the range and depth of analysis of the political and philosophical conundrums that we still face here in the leftosphere. So until next Sunday, as Comrade Alex suggested, go read some hard-ass philosophy, maybe bang your head into a wall a few times, and then get up and get out there and help spread the radical message we're trying to offer here. See you next time.